They say nothing good ever happens after midnight, but there's something about 3 a.m., that ungodly hour, when the veil between our world and the unknown seems to thin. It's the time when the air grows heavier, when shadows stretch unnaturally, and when the silence becomes almost deafening. And then it happens. Knock, knock, knock. 3 slow, deliberate taps against your door, against your window, against the walls of your home. Sometimes soft, almost hesitant. Other times sharp and insistent. But no matter how it comes, it's always the same. Just when the world is at its quietest, when sleep has claimed all but the most restless souls, something knocks. You might think it's just the wind, a branch tapping against the glass, a trick of your half-asleep mind. But those who have answered the knocking, they know better, because no one is ever there. Or at least, no one you can see. For centuries, stories have circulated about the 3 a.m. knocks, whispers of something sinister that comes calling in the dead of night. Some claim it's a spirit seeking entry. Others say it's an omen of death. And then, there are those who believe the knocking isn't meant to get in at all. It's meant to see who dares to listen. Tonight, we dive into the terrifying truth behind this phenomenon. Where does it come from? What happens to those who hear it? And most importantly, if it happens to you, what should you do? Or rather, what should you never do? The phenomenon of knocking at 3 a.m. is not a recent mystery. It has been whispered about for centuries, hidden in old folklore, buried within grim historical accounts. Across cultures and continents, the unholy hour of 3 a.m. has long been associated with something unnatural. Some say it is the devil's hour, a time when the forces of darkness are at their strongest, when the boundary between the living and the dead grows thin. Others believe it is a direct mockery of the Holy Trinity, a perversion of sacred numbers meant to lure the unsuspecting into acknowledging something they should not. But the knocking, that dreaded rhythmic tapping, has far darker origins, the omen of death. In medieval Europe, it was believed that hearing 3 knocks at your door late at night was a warning from the other side. Peasants spoke of shadowy figures that would stand just beyond the threshold, unseen but always there, waiting. The story said that if you answered the knocking, someone in your home would die within 3 days. Some believed it was the work of spirits. Others whispered of something far worse: the hollow men, spectral entities that traveled between the world of the living and the dead, selecting their next victim. No one truly knew what they looked like, for those who had seen them never lived to tell the tale. But there was one thing everyone agreed upon: you must never open the door. The night caller. In rural Appalachian folklore, there exists a legend of the night caller, a sinister force that preys upon those who dwell alone in the mountains. The stories warn that if you hear knocking on your cabin walls at night, it is not the wind. It is the night caller testing your resolve. The knocking always comes in 3s. The first time, it is a warning. The second, an invitation. The third, if you answer, you are never seen again. Old-timers tell of hunters who vanish without a trace, their cabins left undisturbed except for deep scratch marks on the inside of their doors, as if something had not broken in, but rather something had been let in. The unfinished ritual. But perhaps the most disturbing of all is the tale of the unfinished ritual, a ritual known across many cultures but never spoken of in full. It is said that certain entities, creatures not of this world, are forbidden from entering uninvited. They can tap against glass, scratch at wood, whisper through the cracks, but they cannot step inside unless you acknowledge them. That is why they knock. They knock, waiting for you to break the silence, to acknowledge them, to give them power. And should you be foolish enough to knock back? The night it began, Michael wasn't the superstitious type. Ghost stories, urban legends, none of that ever really unsettled him. He was a man of logic, a firm believer in explanations, coincidences, overactive imaginations, the mind playing tricks on itself in the dark. So when the first knock echoed through his apartment that night, he barely reacted. At first, he thought it was someone at his front door. Maybe a late-night visitor, maybe a neighbor who had lost their keys. But when he checked the peephole, nothing. The hallway was empty, bathed in the cold glow of the emergency exit light. Frowning, Michael locked the deadbolt and turned away, shaking his head. Thin walls, old building, no big deal. But then it came again. Not at the front door this time. At his bedroom window. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. His heart stopped. He lived on the 5th floor. His breath caught in his throat as he turned toward the window, his mind already racing for an explanation. A bird. The wind. His fingers twitched as he reached for his phone, suddenly feeling the weight of the silence that followed. He forced himself to move, inching closer to the window. The curtains were drawn, thick enough to block out the city lights beyond. Slowly, he extended a shaking hand and pulled them apart. Nothing. No one was there. No fire escape. No ledge. Just empty space beyond the glass. A nervous chuckle escaped him. Just my imagination, he told himself. Just my mind playing tricks on me. But then his phone buzzed. A new text message. Unknown number. The words on the screen made his stomach drop. Don't open the door. Something was out there. A chill ran down his spine. He stared at the message, his fingers hovering over the screen. A prank. A wrong number. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to breathe. Then came the 3rd knock. This time, from inside the apartment. Michael spun around so fast he nearly tripped. His closet door. It was closed, just as it had been when he went to bed. But now, standing there in the dim glow of his bedside lamp, he swore he saw it. A shadow moving underneath the door. The air in the room grew thick, pressing against his skin. His instincts screamed at him to run, to get out, but his body refused to obey. Slowly, he backed away, never taking his eyes off the door. His phone buzzed again. Another message. It knows you heard it. Michael's breath came in short, panicked bursts. His hand shook as he typed out a response. Who is this? He hit send. A long pause. The screen stayed blank. And then another reply. Whatever you do, don't knock back. His blood turned to ice. That was when he heard it. A quiet tapping sound. Not from the door. Not from the window. From right behind him. Michael didn't turn around. Something deep in his gut, some primal instinct buried beneath years of rational thought, screamed at him not to move. His phone vibrated again, the glow from the screen casting eerie shadows across his trembling fingers. Unknown number. Stay still. It will go away. His breath hitched. Every muscle in his body was locked in place, rigid with fear. His ears strained to catch any sound beyond the frantic pounding of his heart. But the room had gone completely, unnaturally still. And then, in the silence, the knocks returned. 3 of them. Soft, playful, mocking. Michael squeezed his eyes shut, forcing himself to stay frozen, willing whatever was behind him to disappear. He counted the seconds in his head. 1. A low whisper slithered through the air, just inches from his ear. 2. The air behind him shifted like someone, or something, moving ever so slightly closer. 3. His phone buzzed again. He dared to glance down. Unknown number. Don't answer it. Michael frowned. His phone wasn't ringing. Then the sound hit him, deep, resonant, vibrating through the walls. The knock was coming from inside his head. Nowhere to run. A sharp, searing pain lanced through his skull as the knocking grew louder, reverberating through his mind like a hammer against bone. His vision blurred, his knees buckling. He clutched his head, gritting his teeth to keep from screaming. Something was inside him. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the knocking stopped. The silence was suffocating. His ears rang with the absence of sound. Dazed, he stumbled backward, his hands still pressed to his temples. The pain was gone, but something felt wrong. The air in the room had changed. He wasn't alone anymore. Slowly, mechanically, his body turned, even though every fiber of his being told him not to. And there it was. The closet door, once closed, was now wide open. Darkness yawned from within, impossibly deep, as though it led to someplace much, much farther than it should. And standing just beyond the threshold was a figure, tall, unmoving. Its shape was human, but distorted, as though reality itself was struggling to hold it in place. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and though its face was obscured by shadow, Michael knew it was staring directly at him. His phone buzzed one last time. With shaking hands, he lifted it. Unknown number. It knocked. You heard it. Now it's your turn. His breath came in short, shallow gasps. His pulse thundered in his ears. He didn't want to knock. He couldn't knock. But his hand was already moving, as if something else, something unseen, was guiding it. Slowly, he raised his knuckles. And then, he knocked. The screen cuts to black. A sharp inhale echoes through the darkness. Then, a final message appears on the screen. Once you knock back, you've let it in. You knocked. Michael tried to step back, but his body didn't respond. His arms, his legs, his entire form felt disconnected, like he was floating in some endless, shapeless abyss. He was no longer in his room. The knocking had pulled him somewhere else. His breaths quickened. The space around him wasn't just dark, it was empty. A void, a place between places. And yet, something was here, watching him. And then, a hand, cold and impossibly long, reached out from the black. Michael's body convulsed as icy fingers wrapped around his wrist. His skin burned with cold, his veins turning to ice beneath his flesh. He tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the void. The figure from the closet stepped forward, emerging from the nothingness. No longer a shadow, no longer a shape lost in the dark. Now, it had form. It looked just like him. The other Michael. It grinned, a grotesque imitation of a human smile. Its teeth blackened, its lips split and rotting. And its voice, a hollow, empty echo, whispered the words that sent pure terror through his soul. Now you're the one behind the door. Michael thrashed, fought, but the darkness clung to him, dragging him deeper into the abyss. Then, as if reality itself had unraveled, he was falling. The return. The sensation of hitting the floor jolted him awake. His body ached. His head pounded. His vision swam as he pushed himself upright. He was back in his apartment. The room looked the same, familiar, unchanged. But something was different. His limbs trembled as he reached for his phone, his fingers stiff and numb. The screen flickered, glitching, distorted text swirling across it in an unreadable mess. He swallowed hard, glancing toward the closet. The door was closed. Had it been a dream? A hallucination? A trick of his exhausted mind? His thoughts spun, desperate to rationalize, to explain what had happened. Then, a knock. Michael's breath froze in his lungs. Not from the front door. Not from the walls. From inside the closet. His phone buzzed one last time. Unknown number. Don't open it. They say knocking at 3 a.m. is never just a coincidence. Some believe it's a call from the other side, an invitation from something that should never be answered. Others claim it's a test, a way for the unknown to see who is weak enough, curious enough, to open the door. But what if it's something worse? What if the knocking isn't coming from outside your home, but from within? Michael thought it was just a dream, just a trick of the mind. But the knocking continued, night after night, louder, closer. Each time, the messages grew stranger, the warnings more desperate. And then, one night, the knocking stopped. Silence. And that was the worst part. Because when the knocking stops, that's when you know. The door has already been opened. A long pause, letting the dread sink in. So the next time you hear knocking at 3 a.m., ask yourself, who or what is on the other side? And more importantly, did you already let it in?